Wonderful. So I would like to kick things off by welcoming everyone and giving just a few brief comments to frame these sessions that we're having. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is the first in our series of foundation sessions, and we're calling them Fabulous Foundation Fridays. It's a three-part series to highlight various program officers from different foundations that fund educational research projects. And the goal is to allow faculty to learn about the great work of these foundations by hearing about their core mission and learning about trends and funding goals, and the opportunity to meet one-on-one and discuss possible grant applications that you're considering submitting. Today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Elizabeth Pungello Bruno, who is the director of the Brady Education Foundation in North Carolina. And if Dr. Bruno will oblige me, I'm going to do a brief introduction because I was doing a little bit of research on your background, which is extremely fascinating. Do you mind if I share it before we
Go ahead? It's a unique path, so that's fine.
Wonderful. She has such vast and rich experience. And so I see that Dr. Bruno received her BA in psychology from the University of Rochester and her master's in child clinical psychology. She holds also a PhD in developmental psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prior to shifting her professional efforts to this foundation, Dr. Bruno was a research associate professor in developmental psychology at UNC Chapel Hill, as well as serving as a scientist at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. Her research focus is on early care and educational environments with school readiness skills of at-promise children funded by grants from private foundations and government agency. So, and just from her introduction on the website, I'll just tell you a tiny bit more. Specifically, her work has included the investigation of the long-term outcomes of the, I hope I pronounced this right. This is an incredible title, the Abecedarian Project. Did I say that right?
You did. Good job.
Oh,
yeah.
I've never heard of that word, so I'm learning something right away. The Abecedarian Project, it's a longitudinal study of the effects of early education, ages 0 to 5, on cognitive, academic, social, emotional, and health outcomes through adulthood. She's also worked on exploration of the associations among ethnicity, income, parenting, childcare quality, and language development and school readiness. And she has investigated factors that influence why and how parents search for and select childcare. Very, very fascinating as a parent. Dr. Bruno currently serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Marriage and Family and the Early Childhood Research Quarterly. She's published several articles and book chapters on early education environments, family circumstances, and child outcomes. And in addition, she serves on a number of impressive boards, but impressively serves on many different board of directors. So once again, thank you for your very valuable and precious time. We really appreciate it. Today, our format is that first we'll have Dr. Bruno provide an overview of the Brady Education Foundation. And if we have a few minutes, you are welcome to pose some questions before we do the breakouts into one-on-one meetings. So we will start the one-on-one meeting sessions at 11:40 a.m., at which time Dr. Ellen Handy will have her time slot. And then at 12 p.m., we transition to Dr. Provenzano and Dr. Koski, and they have a time slot with Dr. Bruno. So the only thing I can ask in terms of housekeeping is if that's not your time slot, if you wouldn't mind exiting the Zoom room, because we just decided to use one Zoom room instead of like breakout sessions to keep it clean and simple. So if you're not having a time slot, if you wouldn't mind exiting the Zoom room, that would allow privacy just for a one-on-one conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bruno, who has her slideshow here to present with us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and for the introduction as well. So I just have a few slides that are really mostly to help me remember to say the things that I need to say. But if you want to jump in, if you have a question, or we could do them at the end, either way. But just gonna give you pretty much an overview of the foundation, where we've been, where we are now, and kind of our current funding priorities, and then just some high level stuff about application guidelines. So, and I will point out that this beautiful logo right here was created by my daughter. So the mission of the foundation, we're really focused on closing the educational opportunity gaps that are associated with race and family income. And I'll kind of do a little bit of how we got to this place in a minute. But a really important focus of the foundation is that we really want to fund projects that involve collaborations between educators and researchers. So, as you talked about my background, I spent a lot of time really just in research at university and saw a lot of work that just wasn't going to be feasible in the real world. And so our board includes practitioners as well as researchers, because that's a big part. Mostly right now we're funding research and program evaluations, but I'll be talking about how we're thinking about going in some other directions as well. But a real important point of it is that we really want the findings of the research that we're supporting to be able to inform private funders, but also public policy. And I'll be talking about that evolution as well. So the current foundation, Brady Education Foundation, in 2001, became the Brady Education Foundation. Before that, it was something called the W.H. Brady Foundation, established in 1954. I'm not going to go through that history. That is a very long history and how it became what it is today. But maybe one day, if we're all having a glass of wine, I can go through that very long history. But more, I'm just going to focus on the evolution of BEF. So when we started back then, really the main focus was on poverty and just thinking about kids in poverty. And then, we had this evolution where we realized that there were just a lot of code words that were being used. And then, for example, we started getting into underrepresented and under-resourced communities, still kind of talking in code. And right now we're just kind of straight up, we're talking about race, we're talking about family income, and we just want to name what we're really talking about. And along the same lines, the problem that we were focusing on the achievement gap again. Then, realizing, that's really not what we're talking about. When we're really looking at the issues that we're trying to address, it's not kids and not achieving. We're looking at, access, opportunity, and how our program's opening that up. So we kind of went through this evolution as well, where we used to talk about achievement gap, then opportunity and resulting achievement gaps. And again, now we're just naming it, and really focused on equity and access. That's really what our main focus is. When we started, a big impetus, a big motivation for funding evaluation research was that we saw, when I kind of left the research world and I entered the philanthropy world, I was stunned by how much funding was going on without any kind of understanding of what the impacts were and what the effects were. But there were a lot of funders who wanted that data. So they wanted the data and they were telling programs you need to be evaluated, but they didn't want to fund the evaluation. And also, we're not a huge foundation. Like, we're not Gates, I wish, So we realized that, maybe a really important niche for us is to be able to provide that evaluation funding for the programs where philanthropy is saying, show us your data. But then, over time, we realized, Bezos is dumping in, his $2 billion, whatever it is, and it'd be great for that to be informed. But if we really want to be addressing the opportunity gaps, if we really want to be increasing access, and thinking about equitable learning opportunities, it's public policy. That's where the real money is. So right now our focus is on philanthropy and on public policy. And there's a part of the application that really talks about impact. Are there certain philanthropies that you're working with, or are there certain policies that you're able to address on a local, state, or national level that the work is really going to be able to address? And I see a kid. Yay. Hello. Yay. Okay, sorry, moving on. I'm very distractible by young children because they're awesome. Okay, so another just evolution that we've gone through, and this one actually brings you to a place that we are today. When we came out straight up, I came out of the research world and we control everything that we possibly can. And we were like, RCTs, that's the only way, it's the gold standard. And waitlist control, RCTs. But that doesn't always work in the real world, right? There are a lot of, so maybe a program is oversubscribed, but that's also because of a lack of resources. And so, so we realized that, yes, we want to use rigorous science. Yes, we want to be able to understand impact, but RCTs, they're good for answering a certain question in a certain place and time, but they're not the be all end all. And so that was an evolution that we went through. And really we're at the point right now where we're examining this, like currently, these are current discussions. So you guys are a little bit behind the curtain here. Really thinking about equity and evaluation. When we put in these designs and we decide that this has to be this is how we have to answer all of our questions, that actually gets in the way of getting really good knowledge that can be informing exactly the people who we're trying to inform. So we used to be like, no qualitative data because it's expensive and we're relatively small. So we would be like, okay, go find another source for your qualitative, because we knew it's really important to have the quantitative and the qualitative together gives a much bigger and more informed answer. So we're talking about how can we do this with our limited capacity? How can we actually bring, this equity lens to how to the actual research and how we're answering these questions. So I'm happy to talk more about that later if there's some questions. Here's another evolution, and I think this might be the last one. Honestly, when we straight up came out, even though what we were focused on, and even, when you think about the populations and the research that we were funding, we should have been thinking about this, but we weren't. People would just kind of submit, and we would look at the quality of the research team. We would see, what other grants these people with the team had, where they were doing their research from, publications, things like that. We didn't even track, like, let alone think about, like, at all, the race or ethnicity of our grantees. But again, just in our evolution, and also looking back at even my own work and my own research and my own research teams that I'd worked in the past, we realized, you know what, there's a whole perspective that really needs to be brought to bear when you're thinking about the kinds of research and what we want to do, what we want to be impacting, and what our mission is. So then we kind of went through this phase where we had, well, we favor, if your project concerns communities of color, we favor projects in which the leadership team, and we mean at the PI, co-PI level, that's what we mean by leadership, like to actually have voice, including scholars of color. But recently we've actually made it a requirement. I think we're about to go through our second round. We're still learning. We are absolutely still learning about this. We had a big RFP, a big project that we did. That was the first time that we actually did this, that we required every single team that was part of that big initiative, because of what we were focused on, had to include at that level researchers of color, scholars of color. But we really learned that teams that had already been collaborating before, it worked really, really well. But when we forced teams to, like, do this to check off a requirement, we learned that, there are other things that need to happen. So we're still learning. We're still learning about how to ask about this. We're still learning about how to create the teams, how people can make sure that there still is voice, like, even though it's PI, co-PI level, like, that it's authentic, that it's really happening. And so we're sticking with it, but we're also recognizing that we have a lot to learn in how we're making this happen. And so that's another thing I'm happy to talk about. But we're really clear that if the project includes communities of color, there has to be a scholar of color at the leadership level to be really informing, how the research is being done. Not just a consultant, not just an advisory community group, but a researcher who understands all of the nuances about research, the measures that you're going to select, all of those things, and be able to be there and have voice to be able to say, hey, actually, that's not appropriate. Or yes, this is going to be a great way to do this. This is the right question. This is how we want to do this. So types of grants, the kinds of programs that, so this is just the unsolicited kind of, just anybody can apply for these. types of grants where it's program evaluations. And the things that we're really looking for on the program side is that the program is feasible and sustainable. Again, going back to my work in the ivory tower, like, is it actually going to happen in the real world? Is it accessible? You know, that we really evaluate, is this program, like, in terms of, from our perspective, is it worth getting the evaluation? You know, only if families can actually access it. And is it strength-based? You know, a lot of research, and I'm happy to go into this too, even my own research was done with deficit models. And we've really recognized, hey, if we actually want to be promoting outcomes in kids, we got to figure out what are the strengths that are being developed that we can be capitalizing upon, instead of just looking at populations and being like, oh, you're missing this, you're missing this, you're missing this. Well, we were missing all these great strengths to build upon. And there's some really exciting work that's happening in this area right now that I think can have such a big impact on how effective our programs are. So that's a big piece of what we evaluate, or when we're evaluating proposals. Then we also have other types of grants, but these are invitation only. So we've been doing some policy studies, just Children's Equity Project, for example, they just released a big report of policies that really need to be changed in terms of equitable access. And so we're funding them right now to kind of do the next phase of that. And they're looking at across the different states, what are some states that are kind of ripe for the picking, that are really ready to implement some of these policy changes. So that's an example of some of the policy stuff that we're doing right now. Also, we're doing some measurement development work. We're one of the funders of a consensus study National Academy of Sciences is doing on the opportunity gaps. And we've done one major initiative. There are a lot of things that we learned along the way on that one, but those are all invitation only. But that doesn't mean that there's not a way to let us know about what if you have an idea along these lines. So application guidelines, very, very, very first thing. There is a document posted on our website, review criteria document, that literally goes through everything that we score and says, and this is a high score, and this is a high score, and this is a high score. We try to be as transparent as possible, just because there's a lot of work that goes into an application. And so our thinking is that researchers can really kind of like look through that and evaluate, hey, I'm going to be able to do that given their current their funding priorities are this, my project is this fits, or actually if this is what they're looking for, then this project, maybe I don't need to go through the whole application process. But another way to find out, let me just say this. The other thing is that it's really important to look at that, because there are certain things that just completely disqualify applications so that they don't even get to the full board. And so that's another really important reason to look at this. For example, if a program is for profit, we're not going to fund that evaluation. If the evaluator is a for-profit group, we don't fund those. So that's important there. So another way, though, to get some feedback, we're a pretty small office. And so we usually don't talk to folks like the people who I'm talking to today. Like this is because we're doing this, but it's not a usual thing. It's before somebody submits a stage one, it's just, we don't have a lot of time to do a lot of one-on-ones. So what we have is this optional, not required, anybody can still submit an application, but optional pre-review, just a 500-word statement that you send in that, you know, here's all the information. This is all posted on the website, but these are the kinds of things that we're looking for. But this is the place that if you have an idea that's not a program evaluation, that might be a policy study or, you know, measurement or one of the other things that's still consistent with our mission. It still has to be focused on our mission. But you have an idea that you think, gosh, looking at the other things that we seem to be funding recently, really consistent, submit a 500-word statement. And then that's the place where if we do think, hey, this does have merit, then we'll send you an invited application that's more consistent with the type of study that might be being submitted. But still review the review criteria document, because that does have a lot about our mission and about really it is what are the goals of what we want to do. We still want this to be, in the end, ultimately informing, you know, policy. Honestly, eventually it would be great to really move the needle. Okay, so then we have a stage 1 and stage 2 application process. Anybody can email applications@BradyEducationFoundation.org to request an application. Don't have to do, like I said, don't have to do the 500-word statement, although it's kind of in your best interest to do that. Then if the board votes to invite you to stage 2, basically the process is that the board will, you'll get a letter that says, these are a whole bunch of questions that the board wants you to consider. And then you turn back in basically your stage 1 application with your response to all the questions that the board raised. And there might be amendments to the application based on based on some of the suggestions or some of the questions that the board raised. Now, unlike before stage 1, where there's very little interaction between us and the applicant, between stage 1 and stage 2, lots of phone calls as they're needed, lots of communication to clarify questions. If, hey, we're thinking about responding to it this way, what do you think? So at that point, there can be a lot more interaction. And so these are generally our dates, our submission dates. So it is a bit of a long process. I will say that when COVID hit, we did some rapid response kind of things just to get, because we were really focused on, as all these things are happening, we knew that data needed to be collected like in real time right then. So we actually sped this up for some projects, but this is our typical cycle. And then just a few other points. Grants can be a total of 3 years at the maximum. Generally, now I hate this part because everybody always wants to know this, but then the next thing you know is we get applications that say $100,000 a year, and like miraculously, it's like exactly that amount year over year. But we also recognize that people need some kind of guidance. So this is generally, projects come in above this, projects come in below this. We understand that, tasks change over each year. Data analysis happens, data collection happens this year, and data analysis happens this year. So we expect things to fluctuate. The most important thing is that budget justification, where you say, look, these are the tasks that need to be happening. These are the people who are going to do the tasks. This is how much FTE that requires. These are the supplies that they're going to need to do it. And then we can evaluate it. And often between the stage 1 and stage 2, there's budget conversations that happen as well. But at least this gives you a general idea of what the range that we tend to fund in. Because, if you come in at 500K, it's probably not going to get a second read, honestly, because it's just so far above what our capacity. And then just to get this question a lot, at this point, about 12% of stage 1 applications are eventually funded. So really, back of the envelope is 10%. Right now, it's 19% of the stage 1 applications get invited to stage 2. And the number of stage 2, the percentage of stage 2 applications getting funded tends to run between 50 and 60%. We're at 60% right now for some reason. And then the website provides complete information on all the application guidelines. Pay attention to the indirect cost policy. For example, under $50,000 grants, no indirect costs can be charged. Above 50,000, it's capped at 10%. There's a whole bunch of information on there on what we consider to be indirect versus direct costs. And I think that's it. Should I stop sharing my screen? I think I will.
Sure, if you want to. Does anyone have any questions before we break out into the individual meetings?
None?
Question. I'll just speak since we're a small group. And I apologize. I have to jump off at 11:30 before our individual meeting to meet with a school district. But thank you. This is super helpful. One of the questions our team has is how the foundation's defining a program. What bounds a program? So for instance, much of our research is in school reform, and some of those interventions are at the school level. So for instance, community schools, wraparound schools. And so can you describe a little bit about how the foundation, what they consider a program?
Yeah, that's also something that's evolving over time, because, when we started, it was so, clear, like think tools of the mind, or, think something like that. That's easy to implement, and let's randomize, and then let's look at impacts. But, school-wide, one of the issues that we've really run into for more like school-wide interventions and things like that you're talking about RCTs don't work for that, and it's like, okay, so we have 2 school systems who want to work with us. So, okay, it's an N of 2, right? And so we are very, very open to, like, this is a place where I would say in a 500-word statement, we're wanting to learn more about how to understand those types of applications better, because we know there's a lot of important work that's happening in this area. We know that it really can, move the needle, but it doesn't lend itself to RCTs or QEDs. So that's something where I would suggest, like in a 500-word statement, say, like, this is the problem, this is what we're addressing, and this is the methodology that is really important for addressing it. And so then that way, I'm usually the one who does the previews. And so then I can get back and just say, okay, these are the specific questions that if you like, one, it would be like, yeah, makes sense, go ahead and submit the application. Or, you know what, it's really not consistent with where we're thinking right now, so you don't have to worry about doing all that work. Or it's, hey, that does sound like something that is consistent with our mission. That does sound like something that with our current funding priorities, we are open to understanding. So then I might say things like, so in this part of the application, make sure you really outline for the board how you're really going to be able to determine impact, like exactly how you're going to be able to say, this is how we're evaluating it. So we're very open to that, although our materials right now and our website right now don't seem like that. So it really is, I would absolutely say, put in that 500-word application, because it kind of gets back to that slide where it's kind of like, and we're thinking right now about all of these things and what really is equitable, right? If we're only going to be focusing on these, are we missing out on all of this understanding that really could move the needle, right? So yeah, does that help?
That does immensely. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, great question. That's important to establish, what's your focus, your bounded scope there with programs. That makes sense to try to establish that up front. Does anyone have any other questions that are coming to mind right now?
It was just clear and completely easily understood.
So Liz, I think we have an option here. Do you want to break out and we can go to our first individual meeting, or would you like